Thank you for joining us for the first of 2 budget trainings being hosted by SVCN. We are so happy to bring this county-focused training to you this morning in support. We're with the support of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. My name is Yvonne Jimenez. My pronouns are she and her, and I am SVCN's Policy Director. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. We welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat, and we encourage you to share your name, organization, and role. Zoom closed captioning is enabled on this call and can be found by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. We are also joined today by an ASL interpreter. So we'll be doing our very best to be mindful of our talking speed and ask that you allow a brief pause between your comments during the Q&A section of this meeting, so that way they can catch up. This training will be recorded and will be shared with program registrants later this week. If you have any questions, please use the raised hand function or use the chat to submit your questions throughout the program. If we don't get to you during the presentation, we'll do our best to answer your questions during Q&A and before the end of the webinar if time permits. Our Budget 101 will be presented today by Asn Ndiaye. And from the training, we'll shift to our panel discussion where you'll hear from policy leaders from the community on some of their tips and tricks for successful budget advocacy. And then we'll wrap with a Q&A and announcements. Before I turn it over to Asn, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Santa Clara County, we are living, learning, and organizing on the ethnohistoric tribal territory of the Tamian Ohlone, who were the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into the missions Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. Together, let's commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous people and communities neglected and displaced by the U.S. government and other colonial powers across the world. We encourage you to learn more by engaging with local Indigenous-led nonprofits that serve your community. Thank you. And with that, over to you, Asn.
Hi, folks, and sorry about that. I actually had the wrong presentation up, so hopefully, last minute situations. But hi, great to see everyone. Great to see some familiar faces and names here. I know some of you from my previous roles at the city and at Working Partnerships. For those of you who don't know me, it's really great to meet you today. I'm going to be going over the agenda really quickly, and then we're going to go ahead and jump right in because we're going to be a little bit short on time. So for today's meeting, I want to go and give you a little bit of quick background information about what budgeting is, some of the basics of revenues and expenditures, then go into a little bit more detailed discussion of what's currently happening in Santa Clara County. Then we're going to talk about some of the strategies and tools that you can use to help move the needle towards greater equity and greater investments in our priorities. Yeah. So at its most basic, a budget is a financial plan that estimates the revenues and expenditures for a public entity. This typically takes place across a budget year, also known as the fiscal year, which begins July 1st and ends on June 30th. But in a larger sense, budgets are moral documents. They're a reflection of what an entity or a society cares about and what it is willing to invest in, and also in the reverse, what it is unwilling to invest in. Budgets are really dependent on local conditions, but also like local politics and demographics and histories. Budgets are the way that political entities really determine how to allocate resources. They determine what matters currently and also make predictions about what will matter in the future. Budgets are living documents. They are prospective documents. They're trying to predict the future in some ways, and that always changes with changing economic conditions, with changing financial conditions. And then finally, as advocates, racial and economic and geographic equity are really at the core of public budget advocacy, but it's not always at the front of mind for budget officials and for elected officials as well. So I don't know why, but I really like this image of this really poor, stretched George Washington. If you've seen any budget presentations, you've probably seen this image previously. But I think it's just a really good representation of what situation budget planners face every single year. They're being pulled in a bunch of different directions. So you have advocates and elected officials and department heads and staff employees that are all asking for different things. And a lot of these are either new priorities to invest in, current needs, or long delayed needs. And the reality is there are a lot of constraints on budgets. And as you can see, that's why we have this stretched out founding father. The constraints are, of course, financial. But here, there are also a lot of regulatory constraints about what the county can actually do with the money that it has raised in the past and its ability to actually use that money in the future. There's also the legacy of previous commitments that the county has made that it must pay for, and that also creates a constraint on the ability to invest in new priorities. So a lot of this, investments or current priorities or future priorities really dependent on the amount of money that the county can actually take in. As far as the general fund is concerned, and the general fund is essentially the main source of funding for most programs at the county. Almost all of the money comes from, you see that big purple slice, almost all of the money comes from property taxes, but those property taxes are actually constrained by a series of propositions that have passed over the last 40 years that limit the amount of revenue that can actually be raised from property taxes. The county also receives significant support from the state and the federal government, but that funding is highly volatile due to instability and changing conditions in Sacramento or in Washington. There are also a lot of special funds and grants and earnings from investments in properties that the county owns that creates a really great source of ongoing revenue. One really good example of these kind of sort of special funds or special tax revenues would be 2016 Measure A, which was a $950 million bond measure that has funded supportive housing for the past 7 years. As you can tell from this chart, and I wouldn't try to really read the specific numbers. I would just kind of look at the final column, looking at percentages. And then if you could look over at the bottom line, the total revenues, you can get a picture of what the county budget looks like overall. But as you can tell from the chart, most of the revenue that is not going to the healthcare system essentially goes to the administration of county services and programs. About 10% of the budget goes to children, seniors, and family programs. About 5% goes to public safety, and about 4% goes to housing and land use. So as you can tell from the chart here, the county budget is really dominated by healthcare services. And I'm going to be pointing out, the really most important departments within these kind of broader budget categories a little bit later. For folks who are maybe a little bit familiar with the county budget or Santa Clara County generally, it's sometimes said, very jokingly, that the county is essentially a healthcare system that happens to run some parks. The healthcare system is an enterprise fund, which means that it recovers its own revenue required to operate. There are years in which it needs subsidy or investment, as obviously it happened in the most recent years. But generally, the largest portion of revenue coming into county coffers comes from the recovery dollars that the healthcare system generates. So looking forward, for folks who weren't able to watch the budget presentation a little bit earlier this year, based on, again, that most recent presentation by staff, the county is expected to have a budget deficit between $60 and $120 million. Now, in the context of a $10-11 billion budget, this is a fairly minimal deficit. However, it is fairly significant. A lot of that uncertainty comes from questions about the funding from the ERAF, and ERAF is essentially a excess funds that come from the amount of funding that used to go to education. FEMA funding, obviously, and the supplemental costs that were received from the federal government. That currently accounts for the current projected deficit. There are also a lot of sort of factors that a lot of us are familiar with in our own personal budgets, of course, including inflationary costs, recent sectoral layoffs, the huge amounts of tech layoffs that have happened, the federal investments that have sort of tapered off, or since the passage of the American Rescue Plan, are having an impact on the local economic forecast. And then also there's been a really significant slowdown in the real estate market based on the increases in interest rates that have had an impact on property tax revenue. And then there's also kind of a long-term risk around that significant slowdown in property tax revenue, as it is the largest portion of revenue for the county. Other potential issues looking forward for this budget year is that the budget office is currently, unlikely to recommend any personnel or program cuts. They've indicated that they think that they're going to be able to recommend efficiency and savings throughout departments in order to be able to sort of take care of that deficit. But there are some potential issues coming down the pike. The current vacancy levels are probably unsustainable. They, as of again, a couple of months ago, said that the current vacancy levels are about 11% currently. And then, of course, there are ongoing labor group negotiations, particularly with the largest employee group, SEIU, that are likely to have a really, really strong impact on fund balances and available funds for contingencies. And I'm going to go ahead and define fund balances and contingencies in a second. So looking again at the big picture here of how Santa Clara County spends money, essentially, you can really see that the biggest slice is that health and hospital committee, which is 44% of the overall budget. 32% goes to finance and operations, 11% goes to children, seniors, and families, 9% to public safety, 4% to housing and land use. Within these sort of big buckets, there are some really, really important departments. So under finance and government, you're thinking about facilities and fleet management, all of the county buildings and offices. Servicing that debt, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you always have to pay off, decisions that were made in the past, liabilities. The Office of Supportive Housing is actually under the Finance and Government Committee, and also technology investments for the county. Under public safety, as it sounds, pretty much as it sounds, that's where the sheriff is, the district attorney, and corrections and jail operations. Under Children, Seniors, and Families Committee, the Social Service Agency, and in-home supportive services. And then under housing and land use, you'll find like parks and planning and the fire department, the county fire department. Under the biggest slice of expenditures, this is where you'll find probably the biggest departments in the county, which are public health, behavioral health, the Valley Health Plan, and our county healthcare system, including our medical centers and the recently purchased O'Connor and St. Louis hospitals. So talking about fund balances, basically a fund balance is what happens at the end of the year when the county essentially doesn't spend all of the money that it had planned to spend. It's essentially like a positive, not a surplus exactly, but it's essentially a positive balance at the end of the year. The county didn't spend as much money as it thought it was going to spend. As you can see from the chart, going back the last 5 years, the county ends every single fiscal year with a positive fund balance. I believe that's been true since the Great Recession. There's usually a contingency budget, and the contingency budget is essentially a if-then budget. So essentially, it said, if you have the money left over, please use it for this purpose, which is part of actually a lot of the advocacy that folks are going to be doing. That already allocates some of that revenue for specific purposes. But most of the funding goes to, again, that contingency budget, to a capital investment budget, to computer and systems, as well as to replenish reserves. And reserves are essentially your rainy day funds. This is probably this part of the budget, if you're just breaking the budget apart. This is where you're going to be wanting to think about for your budget advocacy. This is the place most likely where if you're looking for funding for your programs, or if you're looking to expand or protect or maintain your funding, this is probably the place where there's going to be wiggle room. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, budgets are living documents, and they are predictive documents. At the same time, budget planners are constitutionally conservative people, right? So they're really, really likely to underestimate revenue and to overestimate expenses. That leads to these kinds of fund balances, which means that, when you're thinking about your budget advocacy, you should be thinking about creating these kinds of contingencies and scenarios about what to do with these positive fund balances. The last point I'll make on this is essentially that, a lot of folks who work in budget advocacy like to say that the budget can change on any given week. And so it's really an effort that happens throughout the year. And when you're thinking about how you want to manage your contingencies, thinking about how you want to manage your advocacy, you should be thinking about it as a year-long effort. To that point, and I don't know if you folks can read that, but to that point, one of the things that I feel a little bit conflicted about giving this presentation is that we're currently actually a little bit late in the budget planning cycle. As most of the folks who have done this work before will tell you, your budget advocacy starts months and months before the first meeting about budgeting. You want to be building relationships already. You want to have had interviews with department heads. You want to understand what your needs are and your asks are going to be, even before the beginning of this official process. Of the dates on this slide, the one that's coming up next week is going to really be the most important, which is when the recommended budget is going to be coming out. And the recommended budget is essentially the best idea from the budget staff, budget director, and the county executive about what the expenses and revenues are going to be for the next year. That is, of course, subject to advocacy and subject to changes by the Board of Supervisors. Sorry. Oh yeah, and then of course the next ones that are going to be really important dates are going to be the ones in the budget workshops in May. It's important to take those opportunities to really get face time with decision makers. However, these meetings are not the only opportunity for you to be able to get in touch with them or to advocate your priorities. And I'll go a little bit more into how to best engage in advocacy with elected officials. And of course, the budget hearings that are going to be happening in June are going to be where you're going to be, one, protecting your existing funding, two, increasing funding and programs, and then three, planting the seed for ongoing advocacy and special requests down the line. The final budget hearing will take place in late June and will usually be one of the best opportunities for special requests or funding that are generally at a lower dollar amount. So current conditions in Santa Clara County and the things that are sort of like creating a little bit of a constraint on the budget advocacy. The economic outlook is, while not terrible, it is concerning to a lot of folks who are planning budgets, around the county, the state, honestly, around the country. High interest rates, inflation. Recent, our biggest industry is currently going through pretty significant contraction, and then there have been some softening of property prices as well, and so that creates a little bit of a constraint about how much folks want to really spend in the future. Some of the major issues that have been called out as kind of priorities for the budget are continuing to invest in our healthcare system and making sure that the county can handle the continued management of the recent hospital purchases that it made. There has also been a real emphasis, especially from Supervisor Ellenberg, around childcare expansion and investment. And then combined with what's happening at the city of San Jose, but also amongst all of our cities in Santa Clara County, a real focus on investing in mental health, in addressing the mental health care crisis and really addressing homelessness in our county. From the Board of Supervisors, some of the priorities that have been sort of signaled for the upcoming budget year, one is, again, that childcare investment, stabilizing the Valley Health System, and being prepared, and also probably, anticipating the increased cost from the new major employee group contracts. So now we're going to actually talk about, budget advocacy, which is, I'm assuming, what most folks came here for. So what I'm going to do really quickly is just kind of talk about sort of overall how you want to engage in budget advocacy. So if you want to have a really effective budget advocacy and engagement strategy, you need to think about it as almost like a multi-pronged offensive, right? You're going to want to hone your strategic thinking. What are your pressure points? What power do you have? What power does your opposition have? What do the supervisors care about? What do department heads care about? What does the administration care about? How do you use the power that you have to be able to move them so that you can get the things that you want, either that's increased investment in your programs or maintaining funding? You also are going to need to engage in a pretty significant amount of research. Budgets are really dense documents. However, if you are working on a very focused area, you can go pretty deep in figuring out what the nuances in these budget line, what the nuances are in these budget line items. You also want to start thinking about how you're going to want to be communicating your asks and make sure that you're speaking from the same voice and are thinking in a way that benefits county workers, our communities, and our families. You're going to want to think about how you're going to want to engage multiple interest groups that are involved in the process and how you're going to build a stronger coalition to be able to advocate in a way that's even more powerful. And then finally, this is really about how you're going to engage not only in this current budget cycle, but also next year's and the year after that. And so that you can build a more sustainable funding system for your programs and for our county. All right, first step. One of your first steps is just going to be research. You're going to need to be gathering the data and the information that you need to be able to speak authoritatively and with the knowledge necessary to be able to win what you want. So one of the things that I would say, and as my budget mentor always says, is you always want to go back in time. That's probably the first thing. It's not about this year's budget, it's about the last 5 years' budgets. You want to look at the annual financial reports in the most recent years. You want to look at auditors' reports, especially departmental auditors' reports for specific programs and departments. You want to look at past budget forecasts and see if they match what the county ended up with. One of the probably number one, not tricks, but one of the number one tips I would really advise is just look at whether or not the county has been systematically under or overestimating something. And then that will actually give you a really good sense of whether or not there's room to move on specific uses of funds. The other thing that you really want to start thinking about is trends and discrepancies. You want to look at trends in revenue and see whether or not the revenue lines are going up at a slower pace than the expenditure lines, which could then lead to potential revenue deficits and shortcuts. You want to look at whether or not vacancies are consistently going unfulfilled for specific departments. And also you want to look at whether or not current allocations for specific programs are either underfunded or overfunded. And then one of the things that's really important, especially for the most recent years, is to look at whether or not things are going to be point in time or whether or not they're going to be ongoing trends. Obviously, we just went through a once in 100-year event that dramatically changed the way that our local budget works. But looking forward, you might not have the same level of sort of crisis level of spending or revenue that happened during the COVID crisis. Right. And then finally, with this research, you're going to want to start thinking about how you're going to develop a narrative about what the county's priorities are. What are the priorities in this budget? How is the county pursuing or valuing equity in the budget? And then what kind of investments is the county making in fulfilling that vision? And so an example obviously would be, so is the county investing more in affordable housing, in roads, in healthcare, in parks, or is it reinvesting in cycles of inequity, like, for example, new correctional facilities? And then Yvonne, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. I think what I'd like to add is the way that you find those priorities. So the priorities in the budget are all driven by the boards. And so one way that you can define them or figure them out is by, really listening to the board meetings. You start hearing trends and kind of the directions and the lanes that the supervisors are starting to take. Asn mentioned earlier developing relationships with staff, and I think he'll get a little bit more into that about developing relationships with board aides, and so that you can kind of start forecasting where those priorities are and seeing where you're in alignment. But all of those things he mentioned Supervisor Ellenberg with children, he mentioned healthcare development. Those are all continuous trends and threads that we hear all throughout all of the board meetings, and in just tracking, listening, engaging in those conversations, you start getting a really clear ear for those things. So that's just active engagement. It's not research just during the budget season, but it's also engaging in the regular board meetings and so you can pick up on those little notes, so you kind of what's coming when it comes down to prioritizing direction for the budget. Thank you, Asn.
Thanks so much for that. One thing I did miss really quickly is just that, even with all of your research, even with all of your analysis, just one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes the money just won't be there. And so you're just going to have to get together with your coalition and go and raise some more money. Obviously, the number one example of that would be 2016 Measure A, but also thinking about whether or not you can leverage federal and state money as well, or this federal and state budget as well to get more funding. So this is just basically about you want to start demonstrating the long-term impact of investments and disinvestment with measurable outcomes in the long run, avoiding fighting over table scraps mindset, and then you'll want to expand the universe of available and current funds. So coalition building and strategic alignment. So I'm going to go over some kind of the basics around coalition building, and then I really want to start talking about how you kind of put all of these things together in a budget campaign. So once you have all the information that you need, you want to start thinking about how you build that coalition to be able to win the things that you want. Some coalitions are just natural coalitions, right? All of the organizations that are recipients of behavioral health department grants and funding, all of the organizations that are recipients of funding or grants or loans from the Office of Supportive Housing. But to really bring to bear the power of advocacy, there needs to be a focus on cross-sectoral alliances, places where there is an overlap of both interest and also impact. So you want to start thinking about how behavioral health working with housers who are engaged in trying to house our residents who are currently experiencing homelessness. Things like environmental sector workers combined with employee groups like a CIU who represent park department workers to help support a greater investment in our parks. So you want to think about where there is overlap, because that's really where our power is. And it's really where we are stronger together, to bring back an old slogan. You also want to start thinking about who are the best representatives for particular issues. So for example, if you're thinking about investment in our healthcare system, potentially nurses are a better representative than administrators. Or if you're thinking about childcare, having parents as well as providers being kind of at the forefront of the advocacy. You also want to start thinking about how you're going to counter misinformation or opposition narratives about austerity and about not having enough or spending too much. You also, and this is one of the things we always say is it's always better to show up with solutions, and you want to think about finding the money yourself and pointing to it for budget staff or for elected officials. And then also you want to start working with your coalition allies to coordinate your budget asks so you're not asking for the same pot of money at the same time. And then finally, you really want to align on messaging and on your board staff engagement. And then, maybe Yvonne will talk a little bit about this a little bit later. But one of the things is that, the board staff or board supervisors, you want to re-emphasize your message, but at the same time, you don't want to just be reading off the exact same script at the same time. So the final thing I just want to say about this before we move on to the next thing is once you have that coalition built together, sort of like what does that campaign actually look like? And a campaign essentially has 4 parts. The first part is, once you have your coalition together, is you launch your campaign. The second part is escalation. And escalation just means you're increasing the level of activity that you're engaging in. And then the next part is compression. You're getting closer and closer to the decision point, and you're escalating the number of actions and activities that you're taking part in. And then finally, the decision point. In some cases, it's called the crisis, but I think for our purposes, it's just a decision point. And that's the point at which you want to maximize the amount of advocacy that you're able to really engage in to really, really bring to bear the power of your coalition. And so when you're thinking about how you want to do your campaign planning, you want to start thinking about how you do it backwards, right? You're thinking, again, the decision point is about 3 months from now, 6 months from now. What do I need to be doing from this launch date all the way up until this decision point that is slowly escalating the number of actions that are leading me to the ultimate goal of winning what I want to win? And I would think about that for the escalation phase. You don't really want to start with your rally. You don't really want to start with like, marching up to 70 West heading, right? Thinking about it kind of like, you're trying to train for a marathon. You're going to start with a 3K, then a 5K, then a 10K, then a half marathon, and then eventually the marathon. And so that's essentially what that campaign planning is like. You're thinking about how you stagger the amount of activity that you're taking part in. So what are those kind of escalations, right? What are some of those steps that you can really take part in? Starting slowly, having meetings with elected officials, direct letters, and then moving on to potentially more public letters and public testimony, and then bringing to bear outside pressure, endorsements from other elected officials, state officials, having employee groups take part in activity, having political organizations, the Democratic Party or other organizations potentially take part in some of this advocacy, having community organizations or neighborhood organizations also take part in activity, and then finally having really, really strong, powerful, narrative-changing public actions like press conferences and op-eds and rallies and public activity that really bring folks along to your point of view. And depending on where things are, that might just be enough. And in some cases, you're just going to need to keep that pressure on in order to be able to win what you want. So part of being able to build that kind of strong coalition is that you're going to need to have a really a good strategy about how to engage staff and engage employee groups. So staff engagement means that you're going to want to start building that relationship with the budget staffers. You're going to want to start, and let me just pause here because I think it's really important to say, I love budget staffers. They're great. Most of them are like straight up nerds. They always want to talk to you. They really want to talk to you about what they've come up with. They really want to check their math and see whether or not what they've put together makes sense. And then that's really a great place for you to be able to engage with them. And so I feel like your role when you're engaging budget staff is really to ask detailed questions about the decisions that they've made for the allocations and the assumptions that they've made. In some cases, you also want to bring the research that you've done to talk about some of those trend lines over the last few years. And I should say too, this is a year-long exercise. You want to be building that relationship early and over the long term so that the next year and the year after that, you're on good terms with these folks and you're able to come at this from a place of fairness. And they also see you as coming at this from a place of fairness as well. This is also really important when you're thinking about employee groups. Employee groups, and especially nonprofit advocates, are really in this together, right? It's really important, especially this year, because the biggest contract is coming up this year, for folks to really start thinking about how you're going to work together to be able to have a fair budget and a fair contract for employee groups. And then you also want to think about how potentially you want to coordinate those budget asks. And then, Yvonne, I don't know if you want to chime in about what it feels like as a board aide to get a lot of this, engagement and pressure.
Oh yeah, it's effective. It's an effective strategy for sure. So some of you may know this, but before joining SVCN, I spent the past 8 years, a little over 8 years, staffing different supervisors as a board aide. I worked for Supervisor Yeager, Supervisor Wasserman, and Supervisor Ellenberg, and the three of them had very different budget strategies, very different ways that they went about, ensuring that their priorities were in the budget. And one of the things that I actually valued, I'll go back to Supervisor Yeager on this, is he had a big focus on hearing from community directly what the needs were, and from engaging with department leaders as well to hear kind of like what the boots on the ground needs were. And then that sort of is what fed up into his priorities. And so when Asn says, it's important to develop a relationship with those department heads, that is critical, because those board aides are also going to those department heads and asking, hey, what does the community need? What are you hearing? What should I be filtering up to my boss? And then developing relationships with board aides is especially important, because they're the ones who are creating these budget briefs. They're creating the budget memos, saying, here, this is actually what we see that's missing in the administration's proposed budget. Here's what we're hearing that's in contradiction. Here are these groups that have come to us and kind of an idea of what those talking points are going to be. And so then the supervisor can start coming up with their reaction. Are they going to elevate those voices? Are they going back and asking for clarification? They start developing their position based on that information. So absolutely, these are very helpful strategies, I would say. I definitely received many letters from different organizations and agencies. I got many phone calls, requests for meeting with me. Later in the panel, you'll hear from Elisa Koff-Ginsborg, and I actually developed a pretty great relationship with her as a board aide, and felt confident being able to go to her organization and say, like, hey, this is what administration is proposing. Does this sound right to you? And I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that if that relationship hadn't been built over time. So get to know your board aides, get to know what areas they staff the supervisors on, start building a relationship there, because you'll be surprised. They're eager for that information. It in many ways makes their jobs easier, and you want their job to be easier, so that way they can advocate on your behalf. So if there's any plug here, it's definitely get to know the staff. And then just as Asn mentioned, in terms of escalation tactics, a slow burn. You don't need to rush to the rally, but definitely make sure that your language is strong and that you're engaging early. So with that, Asn, back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. And then I'm going over specific parts of the budget engagement process. One of the places you're really going to be thinking about is going to be part of the inventory request process. And the inventory process is essentially special budget requests. Usually these are for fairly small amount, or you can go on the county website right now and look up the most recent budget year and see that most amounts are anywhere from $30,000 to $250,000, $300,000. So these are not very, very large amounts of money usually, but they can really make a difference for smaller organizations. And that's usually where a lot of that funding goes. You really want to start thinking about how you use the public workshops as a place to start thinking about those public inventory requests, because they can be made, on nearly almost any time of the year. However, probably the best place has already happened. The timing has already happened. However, even in that final budget meeting, those requests can still be made. So just something to think about as you're thinking about, especially if you're working for a small organization where $250,000, $500,000 would make a huge difference. You also want to be really like working with specific board offices for those asks, because that, and also thinking that even if you don't get it this year, just make sure that it gets into the contingency budget, so that potentially you'd be able to get that later in the year. All right, public activity and engagement. So I talked a little bit about kind of like the step-by-step way of how you want to engage in a lot of these. And so this is the place where you're going to be, where you're having a more public activity. And depending on what your position is, and depending on how the coalition has worked together, you may be in a situation in which you have a favorable board position. And so maybe you don't want to push too hard. You just want to reiterate and reemphasize your points. Or you may be in an unfavorable board position, and therefore you might need to step it up as far as advocacy is concerned. And so you have the kind of big public sessions like the budget session, the board committee meetings, the neighborhood forums, and the county commissions. And those are really places for you to be able to get your point across and get face time with the decision makers as much as possible. I'm going to put a special emphasis on these neighborhood forums or these district-based communications or district-based forums, because those are places where, first of all, I would highly recommend making sure that whatever you are advocating for is localized. So, if you're going to North County, talk about the impact in North County. If you're going to South County, talk about the impact in South County. But it's really the place where the supervisors really see themselves as being the main representatives of. I will say, and I do love this about Santa Clara County, I feel like all of our supervisors are really county minded and not really as parochial as I've seen other boards of supervisors. But you should definitely want to think about how you want to localize the impact of your budget advocacy. And then as far as the sort of like more public activity, again, you want to send letters, do requests for information. And the request for information is mostly just asking for clarification about certain things in the budget, so that you can better hone and better hone your advocacy. You want to start doing public communications, again, especially the importance of district-based communications. Get into the Palo Alto voice, direct actions and community engagement, and then finally, huge coalition actions and advocacy, joint letters, coordinated communications, and public actions. So you get to the point where you get to the vote, right? And where the budget actually gets adopted. But it's not over. So the final budget meeting is usually your last opportunity for budget requests or for changes. They do need to lock in the budget, even if it does change over the course of the year. They actually need to have a budget finalized. But think about this is still an opportunity for you to engage. You can start asking for commitments for staff to explore alternatives or to manage contingencies. This is really where the contingency budgeting really matters. It's also a public opportunity to develop a narrative and prepare for next year's cycle, especially if things are not currently being invested in. And then it's really not over, right? Once the budget passes, you still need to build those relationships with staff and with the board. You're still going to engage in continuing communications with the largest employee groups. And then there's going to be a really great opportunity mid-year where they're essentially going to read the score, right, about the assumptions that they made 6 months prior. And then finally, throughout the year, and for folks who have been engaged in budget advocacy for a long time, I think understand that contracts come up, right? And contracts need to be adjusted to reflect current conditions, especially, paying for employee costs, for recovery costs, and making sure that those contract renewals are realistic. And those are the places potentially where you might be able to have some room to push in order to be able to increase your budget allocation. Okay, so finally, so this is where I would say a lot of your budget advocacy can take place. So, again, that revenue discrepancy, like I had mentioned before, the budget planners are necessarily conservative folks. And so generally you're going to end up having potentially higher revenues than previously planned, and then trying to think about how underspent certain programs are and whether or not some of that money can be shifted. And this is where, you can think about vacancies, capital projects that don't take place, things like that. Contingencies, again, you want to start thinking about what those if-then requests are going to be, and then start thinking about what are one-time budget requests that can occur during the year. And then finally, as far as managing reserves are concerned, generally, most elected officials and most staffers are really, really reluctant to spend down reserves. They're called rainy day funds for a reason, and it's not raining all the time, right? But one of the things you want to think about is are you strategically reviewing whether or not the assumptions for the reserve still make sense? One of the ways that I like to describe it is essentially if you have a 2023 Toyota Corolla versus a 1990 Buick the Sabre, you're predicting like, oh, I should save some money for repairs. I feel like you're most likely going to need less money in that pot for the Corolla than you would for the Buick. And so just thinking about like, do your assumptions about reserves still make sense? And then finally, depending on the economic conditions, it's always good to remember that reserves can always be replenished in the future. But again, generally staff and elected officials are going to be really, really reluctant to touch those rainy day funds. So you might want to think about potentially focusing on other parts of the budget as well. And that's it.
Thank you, Asn, for that presentation. I know that there's a lot of information, and I'm sure we'll have some questions that come up in during the Q&A. Now it's my pleasure to introduce us today to our panelists. Between them, they have over 28 years of local advocacy experience. We have Elisa Koff-Ginsborg. She is the executive director of the Behavioral Health Contractors Association, and Greg Kepferle, who's CEO of Catholic Charities of Silicon Valley. I know we can't really applaud, but if there's little virtual hands, thank you so much for joining us today. I don't see Greg. Is Greg with us already? Does anyone know? If we can't pin Greg, I know I saw him join earlier, but Elisa, if we can go ahead and start with you, maybe if you'd like to share a bit about your organization and who it is that you advocate on behalf of and how you kind of got started in this work.
Sure. Thanks very much, Yvonne, and the whole SVCN crew for setting this up. I am very passionate about budget advocacy. In large part because I used to be intimidated by it, and there is so much power in it that I love sessions like today so that folks can realize that you can get engaged and that you don't have to know everything. You just need to know when to ask questions. So I am the executive director of the Behavioral Health Contractors Association. We're an association of the 32 nonprofits that have contracts with the county to provide mental health, substance use, and supportive housing services as part of the safety net. And Catholic Charities and Greg are part of our association. I just saw Kira wrote that his power went out, so he had to move locations. So I'm looking forward to him being back. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Elisa. We can we'll move on to some of our other questions that we've got, but if you can kind of walk us through a little bit about what your thought process is when you start doing your advocacy work. So you've defined you have this need, right? The individuals that are served by the organizations you represent have something. Maybe it's a need for beds or needs for programming, something. How do you, once you've defined that need, what are your next steps? How do you start developing that advocacy plan?
I think it has different components, but the very first one and the foundation for what you're going to do is being prepared and having the information on it. So if there's a need, what evidence do you have of that need? If you have an idea on how to meet that need, what is that idea? How will it meet the need? What were other options that other people may come up with that they would say would do the same thing? And why do you think this one is best? What's the cost for it? And that's even before you start thinking about where to advocate, right? Then it's what are possible funding sources? We think about the county budget, and the most flexible is the general fund. It's also the fund that I think board members want to try to save for last because it is the most fungible. So are there other funds that potentially could be used for what you're looking at? And identifying what those are and start researching those. So the first part is really preparing yourself. And it will continue to go on as it unfolds. I think being successful is often dependent on being able to clearly define what you're asking for and answer the questions that folks ask you. I think the second component is the figuring out who has influence over the pot of money that you're interested in. So, we think of budget advocacy at the County Board of Supervisors, but for example, with the Mental Health Services Act, there's a whole separate stakeholder committee that goes through and hears ideas and approves the plan before it moves on. And then it moves on to the Behavioral Health Board. And then it moves on to the Board of Supervisors. And so you need to focus first to make sure it makes it to the Board of Supervisors.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of a little bit of the kind of the coalition building, a lot of the groundwork much earlier before they even see the plans.
Mm-hmm.
I did see that Greg joined for a moment and then we lost him again. So we'll just continue. We'll continue on. Hopefully he can join us here shortly.
I'm here.
You're back now.
Thanks,
There you are.
Yvonne. Sorry.
No worries.
My apologies. Our power went out at our main office, and then
Oh,
I'm on my cell. So
yeah.
I am here.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So I just asked Elisa to share a bit about her organization, how she got into the role of doing the budget advocacy, and then also a follow-up question on just kind of laying out what her thought process is on how she starts developing an advocacy plan. So once she's identified that there's a need, what next? What does that mental process kind of look like?
Oh, those are great questions. And Elisa, I'm sorry I didn't hear your answers, but at least you got a recording. So again, hi everybody. I'm Greg Kepferle. I'm the CEO of Catholic Charities. I've been at this a very long time, 17 years here in the county and 33 years in Catholic Charities networks around the country. And as I think about a couple ways to think about looking to approach any government entity, whether it's the county, the city, state or feds, related to budget priorities and advocacy. It's, first I start with, not going for dollars just because the dollars are there, right? But start with your own organization's mission, your vision, your values, and your understanding of the needs and the resources in the community and what those priorities are. And that's going to be different for different organizations just because of who we are, what we do, our history, and all of that. At the same time, then with that, then the way I think about approaching government funding is they are combination of policymakers and partners and donors. And so anytime you have a interaction with policymaker, partner, or donor, what's the first thing? It's about relationship. And so first of all, build that relationship, that trust, be present as a trusted partner. So anytime like we're approaching a donor on a private side, the first conversation is not about an ask. It's not about saying, hey, you got some money, can you give us some money? No, it's about what is their need. So start with what's the county's interest, the self-interest of the county, and their mission, their values, and how do they need us as community-based organizations to partner with them to meet their responsibility to care for the community need. And sometimes they need to be reminded of that, right? So sometimes they need to remember that your mission is to care for the general welfare as directed by the state of California. And here's one way, oh, by the way, look, I can see your strategic plan and I can see your, whatever goals are. And here's one way that we can help you meet your need more efficiently, more effectively. And we invite you to invest through our coalition in the community in this way that will make us together a stronger county, a stronger city. So it's thinking through the relationship, their self-interest, and that it's a common stake, that we all have a stake in improving the lives of our fellow residents in the community. So yeah, inviting them to think about that. And then you can get into all the nitty-gritty details of, all the logistics of, making sure you have the connections with the staff, what the committees are, et cetera, all of that good stuff. So, so I'll just stop there for a second.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. So you mentioned in your response, you mentioned the relationship building and then in the development of that. And then Lisa, you had also mentioned sort of briefly like champions, picking the champions for these things. Can you guys, both of you kind of go a little bit into how you figure out who your champions are? And Elisa, you mentioned some of the work that happens even before you get to the board. So maybe you can talk a bit about how you build up those relationships and with department staff. And then Greg, maybe if you'd like to talk a little bit about like the board level relationships. I'll let whoever wants to start first, but relationship building, identifying champions. How do you find your allies?
I'm happy to jump in. And Greg emphasized the relationships, and Yvonne, you mentioned earlier our relationship, which I think is really important, whether it's with the department or the board. It's building that trust ahead of time. So if I'm advocating for something and I know, for example, a county department has a different point of view, if I am asked about it, I can represent what I hear them say and acknowledge what's reasonable about it, because then, it is what it is, and whoever I'm talking to is going to hear about it anyway. And that's a way to show that, you understand the issue, you respect the different points of view, and then you can make the case of, what you're wanting to advocate for. I would say that I try really hard to accomplish something at the, I would say lowest doesn't sound right, but the lowest level, so the person who is the first person who can make a decision about it. So, if there's something in the department, and, let's say Greg came and said, this is a need we have, and this is a need that all the providers of this service have. So how can BHCA help us? My first question is, what has your contract monitor or the program manager at the county said about it? Because we want to try to, build that relationship, and also see if, it's most simple if you can solve it there. And you don't have to do all the other steps or go to the Board of Supervisors. I'm a big believer in transparency and no surprises. So let's say that we're talking with the Behavioral Health Department about something that we're advocating for, and we're not being successful. Well, I'm gonna thank them for the conversations on it and explain that the issue is so important to our membership that we feel that we need to take the issue to the county executive's office. And I let them know ahead of time so they're not surprised. And then I go to the county executive's office. And if we're not successful there, I thank them again, let them know we're going to go to the board. Because the first thing a board office is going to do is call either the county executive's office or the relevant department. And I don't want anybody to be surprised or feel ambushed, because those are relationships that I need to be able to count on in 2 weeks or a month. And if I'm, kind of using an ambush strategy, they're not going to trust me to have that conversation the next time. At the same time, I had a professor in college who I went and asked for funding for something, and he said no. And I started to walk out, and he said, "You're going to let me just say no to you?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Ask me where else the money is." So I did. And it really also just opened up that no doesn't have to mean no. You can, think about it different ways. You can decide if it's really important to escalate it. You don't want to escalate it all the time, but you be wise about how you use that.
Elisa, I love that. No doesn't mean no. It means not yet,
Yeah.
right? Not now. And it means know that there, KNOW, know that there are other options to finding resources or to finding solutions. And so engage them as a partner to problem solve together. So, okay, so it's not in this bucket of funding. General fund is tapped out here, but there may be some state or federal dollars that could be tapped into that, may have additional restrictions on it, but if you're willing to go that route, that's an option, right? So, yes.
I'd love to, I want to definitely get back to that point about kind of like how you take maybe the no or like a loss and how you pivot from that, what you learn from that. But I do want to give you, Greg, a chance to respond to the question about relationship building. And then I definitely want us to get back to that point about what do you do when you get the no, and dive a little deeper there.
Yeah. So again, as you develop the relationship, you find out what individuals' interests are and their responsibilities, their roles. So figuring out what's appropriate at what level of the hierarchy or organizational structure, and then helping that person be successful in meeting their own needs. So you're standing as partners side by side, addressing a community issue rather than either as adversaries or a top-down petitioner to a patron, a patronage type of relationship. So it's in those relationships, be clear about your own power, because as a community member, we all have power, and also understand the constraints that government staff have. Right, we can advocate. We can go all the way up the chain of command to the Board of Supervisors. They can't, right? And so understand the constraints that they have and respect that and work with that. So I think of it, it's like poetry. You've got constraints with whatever, whether it's a haiku or iambic pentameter, the power of the restrictions of the poem give you that freedom to create alternative solutions. So that goes with then developing the champions, but also understanding where that no might be coming from, that they have constraints on them, and understanding those constraints, and then figuring out, okay, is there a different solution? So for example, we, with Supervisor Chavez, there's constraints on housing. Okay, well then let's go for a bond issue. Hence, then Measure A, which led to an incredible expansion of affordable housing in the county, and inspired others in other counties to be able to do the same thing, right? So, so thinking about, there are possibilities not just within the box, but also possibilities of saying, okay, well, if the current funding doesn't get us there, let's go for new funding. So I think about what we do is with the champions, it's, oftentimes over time, we've had to fight cuts. We've had to claim a stake in the ground for what are our priorities within a budget. And then the third is, then let's create new programs or new funding sources that we can meet a need in the community. And so, going for a bond issue or something like that then becomes a strategy.
Gotcha. That's great. You said something in there too that actually really flagged for me. You mentioned that the department staff have restraints on them, right? And that they can't advocate up to the board offices the way that the advocates can do, that you have a lot more mobility in your strategies. And one thing that I just wanted to call out that I don't know that many people recognize is during my time with the board, there's been less and less transparency at the board level actually into the budget process. Board aides actually used to be able to go directly to budget department heads and really get a lot more input and what did you ask for? What did administration say yes or no to? What are you hearing from the advocates? And that's been severely limited. And so in a lot of ways, we actually have to really rely a lot on your expertise, everyone here in this group's expertise, on knowing what's happening and being able to come to us to represent that, because the communication down is not really open anymore. And hopefully that changes with different county leadership. I'm hoping that there's more transparency again, but for a few years now that it's been really tightened. So I just wanted to share that, because I don't know if that's something that many of you all are aware of, how much we really need you as advocates to come and represent the need to the board offices. So
can I pick up on that?
Yeah.
Just for a second. I know Supervisor Ellenberg and Supervisor Chavez have really pushed for more transparency while this is going on. And one of the things is that the county departments make proposals that the county exec's office considers to put into the budget that's then put out. And those proposals are run through on the agenda of the different board committees the month before. So this past month on the Health and Hospital Committee, on the consent calendar, there was a package of, here are the proposals that the department made. They won't all make it in, but that's a really important time to look at them, because there's first, it's early in the process, but it's a time when you can look at those and say, hey, does this make sense? What's missing here? And talk to the board aides about it, because it can get pulled from consent for discussion. And that, signals to the county exec, even before the budget is put together, that this is an issue that there's going to be advocacy about, and you may be able to have them just fix it there.
Yeah, that's a tremendous, that's definitely, thank you for highlighting that. That is a big opportunity, a point of opportunity. There was a period during the pandemic where those reports actually weren't even making it to the committee. And so the budget request was just going straight through administration. So there would have there wouldn't have even been a way for the board staff to know, right, what those requests had been. Thankfully, now they are coming back. And so we're getting to see more of that, or they're getting to see, sorry, not me, not anymore. I'm not in that world. They're getting to see more of that. But excellent point. At the committee level, when the budget conversations start early, like, March time, February, March time, that's when this advocacy should really start at committee before getting to the board. You've both mentioned a bit about finding the new pots of money and identifying that, and then looking outside of the budget. Can you share maybe just some stories, some anecdotes, some experience that you have in doing that? How you went about it? Measure A has been mentioned, but.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one, I mean, with 950 million was Measure A. And that really was, community coalition with Cindy Chavez as champion. But, a lot of that came out of years of work of housing advocates, homeless provider advocates, doing a lot of work in a public-private partnership, developing those relationships, and with developers, nonprofit developers, and trying to also get for-profit developers. So a number of us, as that came around, we put our own dollars into the campaign. You get the one bite at the apple, as they say, because it's an initiative. It's not a partisan issue. It's an initiative process. So as a nonprofit, we were able to put dollars in there, which then helped. Plus, doing the door knocking and all the outreach and the PR that was not just from on the government side, but also very much on the community side and the nonprofit side. And that was a very successful effort. It wasn't easy. It was a push, but it had a lot of support, broad community support, including from philanthropy, nonprofit, and the community sector. And so, yeah, it's wonderful when it works, but then also you have to defend it. So once it comes through, there's still going to be naysayers out there. So it's not just on the government side. You've got to help with the PR out in the community too, to say why this is so important and why it's still working, and making sure people understand that this is a wise investment and making sure people are safely housed in our community. So
I think the example I'd like to talk about is the Trust program, which is the new mobile crisis response that is a non-law enforcement response to calls for assistance with the behavioral health crisis. The discussions that led to that started in June of 2020, and there were a lot of tragedies that year, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the Real Group had just gotten started, and we were all talking about that, and it was a pretty broad group of community leaders that were very concerned and wanted to do something locally. Now, if you think about it, that's right after the budget is decided on for the year. So in some ways, you might think that's just, terrible time to have a good idea that you want to see happen quickly. A really strong coalition was built because you had a lot of different groups in the community that felt this was really salient and were very concerned. And then you had the members of BHCA that provide behavioral health services who were more familiar with models that could possibly address it. But we're still in summertime, right? And I credit Sparky Harlan for saying, hey, this would be a great innovation project for the Mental Health Services Act. And the Mental Health Services Act is the millionaire's tax. And it has innovation projects that usually take about 2 years to develop and get approved that they're going to move forward. And there's a whole process. It has to go to the state. And rather than accept that that was the process, we just started advocating. So we advocated for this at the board level. We not for the idea in general, not just doing this pot of money, but at the same time had discussions with the department about the pot of money and discussions with board aides. And basically the board directed the behavioral health department to figure out how to do it. And so they started to look at this innovations project, even though it wasn't quite on the cycle they would typically do it. And then the next part of the board advocacy was very different. It was figuring out how to speed up the process so that we didn't spend 2 years of focus groups and meetings and such. And we partnered with the department. They were going to hire a consultant to do all this. And we said, that takes too long. We'll do it with you. And so in December that year, we partnered with other organizations and started holding focus groups where they could get the information that they needed. And every time that there was a decision point coming to the MHSA committee, the Behavioral Health Board, the Board of Supervisors, and finally the state mental health Oversight and Accountability Commission that had to approve it, we organized through REAL. And it was fantastic because we were getting letters, with almost 100 signatures, really diverse. And so in some ways it was kind of the most unusual budget advocacy in that it was off cycle, both of the budget and of the funding source it was. But at the same time, if I had to write a textbook about the best way to do it, and I would say that, just because of the strong coalition that was built, and it just was very organic and coming up from the community.
Yeah, that really speaks to the importance of the collaborative effort between organizations, right? So we've talked a little bit about building the relationships with department staff and internally to the department, but everyone outside, external, all the momentum that has to build. Thank you very much for calling that out. I actually want to take a second here to introduce Kira Kazantzis, SVCN's CEO, because she had a question about and kind of a comment about how we begin advocating for some structural change in the budget and how we bring those community voices in earlier and embed that into the budget process. So Kira, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think I wanted to kind of just illuminate, I think, a little bit of like what we're kind of hoping to, the bigger kind of picture here might kind of evolve in terms of the advocacy, because we learn a lot of tools today around advocating for ourselves as nonprofits and community members, building coalitions to get to, certain seats at certain tables with the county. I think one kind of question here is like, how do we get to a point where there's a structure or structures in the county that actually invite us to the table and consider us and community and nonprofits as key partners, so that we're not having to kind of like look for all the hidey holes of power and influence and things like that. Not that we'd ever probably stop looking for those, but I think, one thing I wanted to point out is that, definitely BHCA and SVCN have been advocating for regular stakeholder meetings long before the budget process in the various departments. So whether it be social services, probation department, or behavioral health or what have you, that, they're doing strategic planning. We're at the table with strategic planning. They're talking about their budget priorities. We're at the table when they're talking about budget priorities. I'd say there's kind of like conceptual agreement with that in the county, but not the implementation is kind of weak. But, every time you see, social services inviting people to kind of a stakeholder meeting, that's kind of like us behind the scenes saying, we really need to talk to your partners, not just contractors, but stakeholders as well. The other, like, just even getting kind of to like the more kind of like grassroots and really more of like a empowerment model is a thing called participatory budgeting. We don't have time to talk about here, but just, one of our thoughts is, as we're kind of training up people around budget advocacy, we're hoping that nonprofits will train their community members that they serve, and that they also can, in a kind of grassroots context, do some advocacy for themselves or with the help of their kind of intermediary nonprofit organization. And in that kind of way, also county and city of San Jose or other cities can create models of participatory budgeting that gives us more access and more say about where money goes. So I wanted to kind of like put that out there, just making sure that everybody knows. I think that your associations are aiming towards this kind of higher goal, and that also just to see if Elisa, Greg, or Yvonne, if you have any comments about that approach.
I think that that's extremely important. And, building it into the process up front would prevent having to, scramble and having to be reactive all the time. I know Kira's been working on this really hard, and it's large institutions move slowly. So, as you start to see more stakeholder meetings and such, that is progress. I'd say that it's not structural, but kind of a model for it is the relationships you build with the board aides. Because, once you've developed that trust and been able to, as Greg said, you're figuring out what they need and how you can be helpful to them, they're going to call you as questions come up. And that's enormously helpful, because nobody can stay on top of all the different agendas and when, issues are calendared for. And I see Paul Murphy on here, who recently retired from Supervisor Chavez's office. But he was on top of all of the agendas. And I was always so grateful, that he remembered that we could be a resource and a partner when an issue was coming up. And I think that that's, kind of the standard we want to move to with the departments and with the county budget office.
Yeah, and I think, Kira, the strategy of participatory budgeting and a structural design for that is really critical, and doing it in a way that is not just lip service or patronizing. Oh, we've held our community advisory group, and we've checked that box, right? It's really got to be, think of it as human-centered design. So we're in Silicon Valley, we can design all these great technology things. A piece of that is designing how we want to be as a society, as a political organization, as a community, as an economic organization. And that absolutely needs to include all voices, especially those voices that are most often neglected, forgotten, or excluded intentionally, or just through plain ignorance. And so to do that requires an intentional willingness to change the way the system operates. And there are a lot of forces, just to be honest, there are a lot of forces of inertia that don't want the system to change, right? And so that's part of where advocacy comes in, and the truth telling comes in, and the hard work of culture change, because it's not just about funding, it's not just about priorities, it's really about the culture of inclusion that needs to change, and that's part of the hard work that I think the Real Coalition is doing in SVCN. within our government institutions as well as within the CBO sector. So absolutely, Kira, and I think, there's ways to do it by creating pilots. Again, human-centered design is co-designing the solutions. And, we've talked a long time with SVCN about, wouldn't it be great that if they just asked the CBOs what a design of a program looks like before they put out an RFP, right? Just even have that simple conversation, just build it in, because they're going to be a lot more successful if they ask the community and if they ask the practitioner what works and what doesn't work. So anyway, our story.
Greg, you mentioned inclusion, and it flagged for me the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and this year's new budget equity tool that's supposed, embedded in the departmental requests for budget augmentation. And one of the things I've heard from members of the Real Coalition and other community groups is that that's not a outward facing equity tool, and that we don't actually know exactly how it's going to be applied. And so when we talk about participatory budgeting, we talk about building in equity, sort of what is kind of the advocacy that should be happening at the county on this tool and how our community groups engage. And so I think that those will be very interesting conversations as we sort of see it applied in the first on May 1st, when the recommended budget comes out. There's supposed to be some language about the use of the tool. So I'm excited to see that. Can you all share a little bit, kind of a pivot about some things that you're maybe that are rising issues that you anticipate that you will see in the budget, or maybe rising issues, things that you may not be seeing, you think, in the budget that you would be mobilizing or advocating around?
Well, one thing there's already some movement, and I'm not sure where it is in the budget process per se, but the whole focus on childcare and making sure that there's, and I know there's already an investment from the county to First Five on this for, building the capacity of childcare. But there's going to be a lot more on that, maybe not in this immediate one, but as we look down the future, the whole building the future strategy of increasing kind of the two parts of the equation on the childcare. One is increasing access and affordability, and then on the other side of the equation is increasing the capacity and the compensation, the reimbursement for childcare providers. And so I see that as not just on the horizon, but coming close, and it's going to be a several-year effort is my sense. So that's going to be a huge priority, especially in terms of thinking about it as an economic engine for Silicon Valley, that workers need to make sure that their children are taken care of, and businesses need those workers. So anyway, we'll see where that goes.
I think Greg talked about something that's exciting. I'll bring up kind of the opposite, which is, given the economy, the frame that's being put on budgets is that we have to tighten our belt, so to speak. And I understand why budget directors are conservative, small c conservative, because, if I was, silly example, but throwing a big party, and I wouldn't want to, forecast a huge amount of funding for it, start buying things, and then, before I pay for the food, I've run out of money. And so I think that, the worst thing for a budget director is to go to their elected board and say they're running out before, they anticipate that. That said, when you're in the context or the environment right now where there's headlines in the papers about all the tech layoffs, and more concern, whereas there's not as many articles of, there's still jobs being created, that, housing market is still hot, maybe not as hot as last year, but it really puts a frame on it that suggests that there isn't funding for new things. And I think it's a place where it's important to question, as well as try to stay on top of, what do you see as the reality? Because there are times when there's recessions and times when there's less money and you have to function within that. But I think that's just, the rhetoric has really shifted. Before this, it was the pandemic and the cost of the pandemic that meant we couldn't do a lot of new things. There's always something, but I think it's important to keep an eye on that.
I think that's a great point. Sort of, I'm going to stretch that analogy kind of a nerdy way, but if we're talking about a party, then maybe the advocates are like party planners, right? A little bit kind of looking into what is the best way that we should be spending those dollars, and how we advocate for those dollars useful. Thank you. Thank you to the two of you for joining us for our panel. I'm sure that there are questions from folks who are in the training. And so I do want to open this up to a Q&A portion. Asn and I will be helping facilitate kind of where the questions go a little. And then we also have Kira, who's available to answer questions as well, and will also help us with question facilitation. So if there's anyone who'd like to speak, if you'd go ahead and raise your hand. This is open question period. It can be for the panelists. It can be for the budget training portion. Don't be shy. You got a lot of information.
Yvonne, while folks are thinking, can I throw out one more thing?
Absolutely.
That came to mind. The biggest challenge I think sometimes is not being able to find information. The budget is a rollover budget, which means that what comes out shows the changes from last year's budget as the base, but doesn't show you what's in there. So it's something place you need to dig around. The other two resources I'd want to point folks to, year round, it's the off agenda reports, and maybe somebody can drop that in the chat, or I can send it later and you can include it. But when you go to a board meeting and the board member asks for more information and the responses will have to get back to you off agenda, there's a memo that's written with that, and they're all posted on a website. And there's usually some very useful information. The last time I checked it, there'd been a discussion about how do we keep the different board and committee and commission meetings on, hybrid, so folks can participate. There's an off-agenda memo in there about the costs, what resources are needed, and the cost. And so if that's something folks are advocating for, that's really useful to look at. The other thing is that during the budget process, after the budget's released in May 1st, board members ask for information and submit questions, and all of those end up being posted. So I just encourage folks to look at both of those kind of off-agenda sources.
Thank you, Lisa. I do see a hand, Jennifer Smith.
Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Kira and Yvonne and Asn. I really want to thank you for doing this as an organization that's sort of tippy-toeing into the world of public funding. And my question is really around, and Elisa, it goes back to your comment, and as you introduce yourself, is this is really intimidating. And so for a small organization that has one development director and multiple streams of funding, to stay on top of, and executive directors that are building programming and all that good stuff, but really have a solid strategic plan and already have some good relationships, where would you recommend that we sort of start? And I don't want to say you presented too much information, because you presented exactly the right of information, amount of information, as here's what we could get to. And now we have to decide on where we're starting and how to carve out our little stepping stones, so to speak.
Go ahead,
So
Ken.
I can take a stab at that. So start with what is your, if you will, your sweet spot? What is your priority, your focus, the population you're serving, the type of service you're doing, and find where is that match. So it's like with your development director, think of it on this side, it's think of it like on the fundraising or the grant writing side, where is that match and where is that opportunity? And you'll need to do a little bit of research. Is it within behavioral health? Is it within probation? Is it within social services? Wherever it is, find out where that connection is, and then make the connection with somebody either on the staff or with somebody in the supervisor's office. So to find out where that common ground is. And then if you're part of a coalition, you're part of SVCN or part of another coalition that's specifically focused on that priority, then see if you can work with folks that are in a similar space. I call it collaboration, right? We're all collaborating. When an RFP gets issued, we may be competing, but maybe we're going to be stronger by collaborating together on that, right? So where possible, I would say collaborate. And if you need to compete, you compete in with a open playing field. But start where your passion and your priority is, just like you would with any, in some ways, with any private foundation, whatever. And then if you do your grant writing, all of that good stuff, if you're not making it in that way, find somebody to help walk with you and coach you and say, hey, is there a different way to find this resource, or could we go together with partners that are in the same arena and go together as a coalition? We've done that on immigration. We have a very strong coalition of immigration providers that went specifically both to the city and the county for immigration resources, rather than just competing against each other. We're going to compete against each other on on different things, but when we can be stronger together, let's go together and then figure out how to allocate the resources as a coalition.
I would just add on the relationship side of it, which may be something you're already doing, is just as you have different events or you have a newsletter, invite folks, whether it's the board, whether it's, other government funding you're looking at, just invite folks to events and to learn more about you, even if you don't have a specific ask then. Because it'll make it a lot easier, once you do come up with what specifically you want to ask for. And I know we don't always think of inviting folks from local government, particularly within departments and such.
Yeah, and also invite to, if you've got a grand opening or a tour, a community event, it doesn't have to be, like a, special fundraiser, but just, something that you've got going on, just, and make it a personal invitation. Yeah. It's all about that relationship first before they ask.
Jennifer, do you have a follow-up question? I see that your hand's still up.
Oh, no, let me take it down. No, that all of that was very helpful. Thank you.
Great. I just wanted to add that I know that there was a lot of information on the slides, and so it can be pretty overwhelming if you're just getting started in this, but know that if you have questions that come up later that come back, maybe as you're watching the recording again, please reach out. We're happy to answer those. And then your SVCN policy team is also here to help guide you and answer any questions that you have and follow up. So if nothing comes to you today, that's okay. It might come later. I'm one of those people where it's like, half hour after the meeting ends, oh shoot, I had a question. So
yeah, this is Catherine. I have a question. I just don't know how to raise my hand. I've been trying to figure out. Yeah. So my question is, many of you have mentioned about a mentor. I'm actually very new to this as well. So I have come from high-tech background. I've been doing education for several years, and I run summer camps in El Viso area. So I'm trying to help two communities, El Viso Hispanic community as well as Chinese community. And I help funding and support them to go to BART and some other internships. I'm very new to this, but I do see a lot of needs. I think I really need is really a mentor to get some questions answered, to navigate the complicated system. Although it sounds very easy for all of you, but it's actually confusing for me. So what is the best way to find a mentor? Or any of you would like to be my mentor? I think
it's definitely a complex process. I wouldn't say there's much that's easy to it. So if you feel a little overwhelmed or confused, that's okay. That's normal. We've all been there. Kira or Asn, do either of you have some thoughts on Kira on mentorship?
Yeah, I mean, one function, that associations serve is kind of connecting people with people. So anytime any nonprofit organization reaches out to us and says, oh, I'd like to work, with other agencies that are working in our space, we'll do introductions. And, you're likely to get a mentorship out of that. Just as might not apply to you, Catherine, because I think you've been in ED for a little bit, but we do have for new executive directors, we do have a formal mentorship program. Greg served as a mentor, and I think Elisa has too, for our new executive directors. That's not to say we can't set folks up with who have been in ED for a while, but there is just first, so people know that kind of formal process for new EDs. But yeah, if you reach out to us, we'll introduce you to people, and then you can make your ask directly.
And then acknowledging that the hands up button can be a little tricky to find at times. If anyone else has a question and just wants to pop up, that's okay too. We can do it that way.
I have a question, maybe for Asn and Yvonne, anybody. So you kind of talked about the timing and just how it's kind of this like long game. If your plan is to kind of make a board approach for a particular project, or even for a bigger picture kind of idea that's maybe not for your nonprofit, but just for community, when do you feel like it's like really just going to piss people off that you're coming to them? I know there, Elisa, there's the trust program counter example, but what's kind of when do you really want to start? And what's the like tactically, what's kind of the order, and when do you kind of say, oh, this is really more for next year?
I'm gonna take one tiny crack at it, and then I'll hand it off really quickly. At least it's been my experience that the two worst times to show up to an elected official's office is October before an election, and January after they've just taken office or just gotten reelected. Generally, they're setting up offices, they're hiring folks, and then in October, it's not that they aren't focused on the work that they were elected to do, but it's obviously crunch time for election time, and it's really not the best time to show up and make any large asks.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. I would say I definitely agree with all of that in terms of the timing. Just a little bit on like the content of the ask in terms of like, when are you concerned that you might piss someone off about what specifically you might be asking for? There's always definitely tact is necessary when approaching some of these board offices, being very mindful about some of the things that they have said in the past, right? And sort of how you approach them. One example that comes to mind is some of the work that's been done around criminal justice reform, and how helpful it can be to find really unlikely partnerships in groups, and how you can approach some people who may be in opposition to your position initially, and you can find common ground. And the way that you do that is by, kind of really looking into those folks, seeing where you have some alignment, where you can kind of come together. And you do that also with the board offices, right? You may have a supervisor that is, I don't know, less willing to provide funding for a program or something, or but if you come to them and you represent the need and you say, hey, I know that these other priorities are in alignment, you can find common ground. So I think just whenever there's topics that could be really sensitive, try and be tactful, try and be mindful of their position, try and not put them in a bad spot too, not to automatically be the bad guy. You want to try and you bring them along. Kira, your hand is up.
Now I have another question. So I'm channeling some people who've asked me questions in the past about this kind of thing. So we talked a lot about diplomacy. We talked a lot about relationships. When do you march for budget? When do you show up with your red t-shirts at board? We didn't really talk about that.
A really good point. When you've exhausted your other opportunities. And it's really important to know that you're going to do that on issues that are critical. You can't do it on every issue. First, it's impossible to get everyone to turn out all those times. But I think it's really important. We've talked about sort of the inside game on all this, but to show up and to do that, and to organize for doing that. And I think it's not just showing up, Kira, Yvonne, Kira, you've done this, and I know Greg has, it's organizing the whole context of it, of having the speakers. And I think it's important to let the board know ahead of time you're going to do that, particularly the board chair. They'll, I think, be much more receptive to the message if they know that they're going to be spending an hour on public comment and can be prepared for that. And I think if you never do that after you've gotten no's, then I think you lose some leverage. So it's not like, I try to avoid it at all costs, but if you have to, you have to. And then folks know that's out there.
Right. It's thinking through, when and why, right? So is it about demonstrating strong community alliance? Is it seeking to get public attention to the issue? So is it more about the PR than about the board members themselves? Or is it about persuading further reflection and reconsideration of an issue by the board? So it's kind of understanding what your goals are for that action.
I think the only thing I would add is unless it's a very, very, very specific issue, in the words of Liverpool fans, you never want to walk alone when you're doing that kind of action. So whatever whatever your asks are, make sure that is like a large ask, and that is something that you can bring a coalition around.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what Elisa had highlighted, I think in an earlier question about not wanting to blindside people, because these are relationships that you develop over time, and there was the notifying the board chair of really long public comment. But I think even when you're about to do your protest action, giving them a heads up, hey, this is why we're doing this. You knew what our issues were, you knew we had concerns, you knew that they weren't really getting resolved or met, and now we're taking this action. And we're still open to dialogue and to continue our communication and relationship building, but yeah, just flagging for people. But there's definitely a time and a place for the red shirts, as Kira says.
And sometimes I think the board members, may be interested, well, why aren't we seeing the red shirts? Right. I mean, so is this issue really that important to the community or not? So,
Yeah.
in some ways it helps confirm to them that it really is a serious issue.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's seeing everyone come out also helps them strengthen their own positions, right? So it's like, yes, there's definitely community interest in this. That's good, but it also helps them if they're in a supportive role. Okay, well, now there's like 30 public comment and it's all in alignment with what my position is. And maybe the board offices themselves has had some opposition from administration. They're hearing some no's, right? So it is part of, sometimes factored into their own calculus with the decisions that they make. Pamela asked in the chat, what are the key dates to know for advocacy? When is action taken by the board? So I think in the budget process, you want to start early. And so you want to start building those relationships, that the relationship building part of your advocacy very early in the year, January, February. The board, in terms of like when the board is hearing budget items, the budget workshops are really big opportunities. So that's May 8th through the 10th are the budget workshops for this year. Those are times when your public comment can really be heard by the board. Your letters can be received by them. They can pose questions to county administration. They can make suggestions, recommended changes to the budget, and then those things would come back during the budget hearing. So I would say the 8th through 10th is some of your first key moments for that public at the board meeting level of advocacy. And Alan just dropped into the chat the kind of the whole suite of dates, of key budget dates. If anyone would like to add, Greg or Asn.
So just the June budget sessions also as well, and then of course like the actual budget hearing, the actual budget vote date as well. And I think the timeline that Yvonne just said, I'm just agreeing with, which is January and February, is really when you want to get started. Budget season to me is at least 6 months long.
It's actually funny. Asn, when you first mentioned that the final adoption date for the budget is also good advocacy day, me internally, I was like, but why that day, right? Why but because we talk about how the budget changes any Tuesday, right? It really does set you up. It's a continuing conversation. This wasn't included in this budget, but it's still an issue, and we're going to still be coming to you, and it can be picked up again when the board reconvenes in August. And so it is an important day. There can still be action by the board on that day. So just because it's the final budget adoption day doesn't mean that it's the end.
And then there's also the mid-year review, which is also a really great opportunity to do engagement. And then the other thing that I think I want to reiterate about contract renewals, just really thinking about when your contract dates actually end, that is essentially for your organization, your budget time, basically, to be able to engage in advocacy as well.
Okay, we're actually right at almost about time. So I do want to thank all of our panelists again, and everybody who's who's asked questions. Again, I want to encourage you to reach out if you have any follow-up that you have. Big thank you to Asn for leading us in our budget training. Big thank you to Elisa and to Greg for their insights. And our next slide is our contact information for the SVCN policy team. We encourage you to reach out if you have any questions. You know, at any time, we're happy to help you kind of dive deeper into the budget. I know we covered a lot today, and it's intense. So we're here to help you out. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.